Welcome to our discussion of the Yellow Wallpaper, which you've all should have read by now. I'm going to try to do this video a little bit differently to minimize some of my stuttering. I will just be reading. I have pre-typed the answers. So let's start with your study guide question number 1. What's the change in the length of each entry and what might this indicate? The length of the entry seems to increase a bit as the speaker begins to ramble. But the frequency of these entries are lessen. There's more entries, but the entries are shorter. This could indicate that she is gaining strength as if it's an obsessive nature. Instead of writing as a hobby or a sort of relief, she has to write. She has to get her thoughts on paper. When someone feels alone, that's often when they write the most. But we also need to realize that these shorter, more frequent entries match her deteriorating mental status. With imagery, we should pay attention to doctors, illness, affectionate names for the protagonist, nursery, infants, infancy, inside and outside spaces. Obviously, illness comes up quite a bit because the narrator is thought of to be ill. Her husband and brother are both doctors, and they offer her medical advice, most of which is to rest. We'll talk a little bit more about the rest cure later. Gilman uses the husband and the brother to show the dominance of men in the culture at this time. There's also to show the male influence over women and the dismissive attitude that they had in regard to women's mental health. Her husband slash doctor, John, never refers to the narrator, his wife, by name. Instead, he uses a variety of pet names for her: darling, dear, goose, and so on. He reiterates the idea that he sees his wife as more of a child, or at least her mental status being that more of a child than a grown person. This is why he's so dismissive of her. John's treatment of his wife as a child reflects the belief that many men had about women at this time. Women were viewed as physically, mentally, and morally weaker than men. This reminds me a little bit of something back in the Civil Rights War. There was a movement among slave owners known as the parental movement. And the idea was that slaves were below the intellect of white men. So by enslaving them, these white men were actually doing them a favor somehow, as if slavery were caring for or giving purpose to their lives. Again, we notice this as being 100% falsehood now, but a similar kind of concept could be applied toward a male and female role during this time period. Men viewed women as being weaker, like I just said, and so by caring for them, they viewed themselves as caring and nurturing women by dismissing our abilities. The main setting of the nursery that the narrator stays in, understand that she's actually in a mental hospital of sorts to try to help her apply this rest cure. We can also use the nursery as being illusion. It's very subtle, but when we realize that Gilman wrote this when she herself, or because she herself suffered from, at the time, what would be called a breakdown or nervous disorder, what we would now call probably postpartum depression. The reference to the nursery helps us realize that our narrator has just had a child. And part of the rest cure, by the way, that she's being diagnosed to follow prevents her from creating writing. She's not supposed to write or anything like that. But she's also being penalized by being removed or forbidden to see her own child, her baby. There are a lot of imagery related to outside and inside spaces. In fact, when the narrator looks outside and is watching the woman who's gotten out of the wallpaper creeping, it's the 4th of July. 4th of July is Independence Day. There's a lot of freedom versus bondage or entrapment represented in imagery throughout this story. And as far as the alter egos, we do have an alter ego with the narrator and her partner or ego self being the woman entrapped in the wallpaper. I have several literary criticisms attached in your folder for this lesson, and some of those criticisms will deal with that ego self and some symbolism on what the wallpaper could represent, different views on that, etc. We've already kind of talked about John's character a little bit, but again, to kind of piggyback on what was already said, rather than working with his wife and listening to her ailments, he is persistent in his belief that there's really very little wrong with her and that it's just all in her mind and she needs to rest. Mental health has always been and still is a touchy subject. It's sadly neglected. A lot of misunderstanding about mental health. But in this scenario, it's much easier just to tell someone that they're being silly and it's all in their head than to actually treat a depressive or nervous breakdown type problem that our narrator is dealing with. If we were, the second part of the question is asking you, would you recommend John, or would you want John to be your husband or a husband for a family member? It's going to be hard for our modern day sensibilities to say yes to that question. I think probably most of us are going to say no, because he knows, whether he believes in it or not, he knows his wife is struggling and he's very neglectful. How often do we see John interact with the narrator throughout the story? He is, for the most part, absent. And I wouldn't want anyone in my life to be that neglectful of me if they knew that I was struggling in some way. And especially, I would want to at least be listened to. The narrator responds to John's treatment. At first, we see her kind of seem like she's helpless in believing 100% whatever John says. She even says in some points, well, that's what's one to do? That's what John says. But as the story progresses, she begins to become more resentful and angry and even manipulative, to the extent of trying to lie about her writing and hide a lot of her feelings and thoughts from him. I'm going to move down to, we've already answered kind of question 6 about the symbolism. The irony in the ending. First of all, John, as a man, sees himself as stronger, superior, and when he walks in and sees his wife 100% mentally unstable, we've had this kind of break in personality, he does a very feminine act, or what would be stereotyped as a feminine act. We don't think of masculine, big old, tough, strong men as fainting. We think of that being like a damsel in distress or a woman, fainting. So this is a female attribute and a very sharp punch of irony, that the man faints in shock, and our narrator, that we now know is named Jane, just steps over him as she continues to walk back and forth along the wall. Why did Gilman write the story? I have a literary article included with those criticisms I was telling you about. We usually classify or approach this particular story as being a piece of feminist literature. Gilman was a loud voice among social reform, but the author herself dealt with depression and was diagnosed with a solution of the rest cure. And she was literally told to go home and remove herself from everyone, to essentially do nothing but rest. She was told not to write, not to be around family. And as she followed this advice, because that's what we usually do when a doctor tells us to do something, right? As she follows this advice, she had the sense of self to know, like, hey, this is not working and this is actually making me feel worse. And so she stopped following the rest cure and got a second opinion. And years later, or sometime later, she sat down to write the Yellow Wallpaper because, in her mind, if she had continued to follow that rest cure, she thought she would have literally gone crazy. Now, Gilman herself never hallucinated or anything like that that occurs in this fictional story, but her real life events motivated her to write this fictional story. She even has said years later, when the doctor who prescribed the rest cure to her read the story, he actually stopped using the rest cure method. And Gilman says, and I quote, "If this was true, then her story had purpose." So that's how strongly she felt about the rest cure not working. I'm going to skip down to number 10. What is wrong with the narrator? Is she physically ill, mentally ill? Um, Again, I kind of touched on this when at the beginning of the story, the narrator is suffering from what we would call now like a mild form of postpartum depression. During this time period, it would not have been called postpartum depression. It would have been considered a nervous breakdown of sorts. Um, and in that case, we can uh, look at it from their point of view. Very little was known about mental illness, about something like postpartum depression, chemical imbalances in the brain. Those things had not really come to light yet. Another thing I want to notice or I want to draw your attention here with the last part of this question, what could account for her condition? Um, by the end of the story, our narrator has is mentally unstable. And when we treat depression with something like the rest cure, every nuance about the rest cure is literally the worst thing you can do for depression. Humans, we are social creatures. If a baby is born and it isn't touched and held and have that and it doesn't have that interaction with people, the baby will die. In prison systems, there's a reason why isolation are solitary. There's a reason why that's a punishment. When you remove people for a long period of time from interaction with others, it is bad for their mental health. Prisoners often do hallucinate. We don't, hopefully, none of us have any personal experience with what that feels like and what that does to the mind. But there's an older movie, some of you may have never watched it, but hopefully you've heard of it because I'm going to use it as an example. Tom Hanks starred in a movie called Castaway. So it was quite a while back. But in Castaway, Tom Hanks' character is isolated on an island for years. And he has full conversations with a volleyball that he names Wilson. He is so connected to the social bond with that volleyball that he actually risks his life to save the volleyball. I'm using these just to show you the need for social connection and social interaction with other people to our mental health. So it's obvious, or it becomes obvious how our narrator, who's being removed from these kinds of social interactions, would slowly begin to lose touch with reality, and her mental health would deteriorate. It is feasible that this could actually happen, um, in a sense, because it's isolation is very bad for our mental state of mind. The social conventions regarding roles of women at the time, I think we've already talked about this. Jenny, the sister in this story, serves as being kind of a foil for the narrator, in that she shows us what a good woman should be at this time period. Um, she's a housewife. She's always happy to do work. Um, she never argues. She obeys. And when you put that into a contrast with the narrator, we can start to see differences, that the narrator is not behaving, especially toward the end of the story, the way a good woman like Jenny would behave. Let's look down a little bit further. On number 14, on what the wallpaper seems to represent in the story, I want for you to look at those literary criticisms here, because there are so many answers we can look at. I'm just going to very briefly mention some. We can look at the wallpaper representing a patriarchal entrapment of the female self. We can look at the wallpaper as being an entrapment set by motherhood, because when a female becomes a mother, she loses her self-identity. I hate to say that, but mothers often lose their self-identity. They're no longer, Christy Morgan. It's so and so's mom, and so much of her life is devoted and wrapped around her children. And it is an entrapment of sorts. And I'm not by any means trying to say it's bad, but it can be viewed as an entrapment. And especially during this time period, when women were not given the types of freedom or equality that we're given today, it would doubly so be an entrapment. And lastly, I want to make sure that you understand who Jane is at the end of the story. Jane is the name of the narrator. We just don't get it till the end of the story. The end demonstrates, think of it as like a break in sanity on behalf of the narrator. She speaks of herself in the third person because she is no longer Jane the narrator. She is now the woman in the wallpaper who has escaped. I sort of see this in kind of like a multiple personality type scenario, where the narrator has slowly been kind of losing herself throughout the course of the story, and this other personality, the woman in the wallpaper, has become more and more dominant. And now at the end of the story, that alter ego, the woman in the wallpaper, has dominated the narrator, Jane. We can see this foreshadowed, by the way, with the author's use of the word creep. Every time she mentions, or the adjective that she used in the way that the woman in the wallpaper moves, is that she creeps. And at the very end of the story, we see that our narrator, Jane / woman in the wallpaper, creeps over John. And so that reinforces that kind of personality split. I hope that this lecture has helped. Again, don't rely just on this lecture to prepare for your exam. Make sure that you read the story well, and that you read the articles as well. Hope you have a great day.